The streets were always loud. Horns blared, people shouted, and footsteps hurried past. Yet, for Aisha, it was the silence between those noises that she noticed the most. It was the silence of people looking at her but never truly seeing her. To them, she was invisible, just another face in the crowd, another young woman on her way somewhere. But Aisha had nowhere to go. At 21, Aisha's life was a far cry from what she had imagined as a child. She had once dreamed of being a teacher, standing in front of a classroom full of children, smiling and sharing knowledge. But dreams were fragile things, easily broken by the weight of reality. Aisha's reality was filled with cold nights, aching hunger, and the constant fear of being found out. For the last 6 months, Aisha had been homeless. It wasn't the kind of homelessness you saw in movies or heard about on the news. She wasn't living under a bridge or begging for change on a street corner. Her homelessness was hidden, quiet, and careful. She slept in shelters when she could, or sometimes on a friend's couch, but most nights she found herself in public places that were just safe enough to sleep for a few hours. During the day, Aisha worked at a small grocery store. The pay was minimum wage, barely enough to cover her phone bill and buy food for herself and her younger siblings, Alia and Malik. They lived with their mother, but their apartment wasn't home anymore. Their mother had been sick for years, in and out of the hospital. Bills piled up and the rent was always overdue. Aisha sent her paycheck to her family every week, trying to help them survive, even though it left her with nothing. No one at work knew she was homeless. She made sure of that. Aisha wore the same clean uniform every day, always showing up on time, always smiling. She had learned how to hide the exhaustion in her eyes, how to pretend that her life was normal, just like everyone else's. It wasn't that she was ashamed. She knew she was doing everything she could to keep her family afloat. But she feared the pity, the looks of sympathy that would come if anyone found out the truth. One afternoon, Aisha was stacking cans of soup on a shelf when her manager, Mrs. Benson, approached her. Mrs. Benson was in her 50s, a short, stern woman who rarely smiled but was kind in her own way. "Aisha, can I see you in my office for a minute?" Mrs. Benson asked. Aisha's heart raced. She had never been called into the office before. Had she done something wrong? She wiped her hands on her apron and followed Mrs. Benson, trying to keep her nerves in check. When they reached the small cluttered office at the back of the store, Mrs. Benson gestured for Aisha to sit down. "I've noticed you've been working really hard lately," Mrs. Benson began, her tone softer than usual. "You're one of our best employees, always reliable, but I also see that you look tired. Is everything okay?" Aisha froze. The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She wanted to tell the truth, to pour out the weight she had been carrying for so long, but she couldn't. Instead, she forced a smile and nodded. "I'm fine, Mrs. Benson. Just a little tired, but nothing to worry about." Mrs. Benson studied her for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she could see through the facade. But she didn't press further. "All right. Just make sure you're taking care of yourself," she said, standing up and handing Aisha an envelope. "Here's your paycheck for the week. Don't work yourself too hard." Aisha took the envelope with trembling hands, thanking her manager before heading back to the floor. As she walked back to the shelves, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had avoided the truth for another day. But deep down, she knew she couldn't keep up this act forever. Later that evening, Aisha sat in a small park near the grocery store, her back against the rough bark of an old oak tree. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm orange glow over the city. She opened her paycheck, staring at the numbers that stared back at her. It was barely enough. As always, she would send most of it to her family, keeping only a few dollars for herself. She knew her siblings needed the money more than she did. Alia and Malik were still in school, and they didn't fully understand the depth of their family's financial troubles. They knew their mother was sick, but Aisha had shielded them from the harsh realities of unpaid bills and eviction notices. She wanted them to have some semblance of a normal life, even if it meant sacrificing her own. Aisha sighed, leaning her head back against the tree, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her. She looked around at the people in the park, families with children, couples holding hands, teenagers laughing with friends. It felt like they lived in a different world. A world where the biggest worry was what to eat for dinner or what movie to watch that weekend. Aisha longed to be a part of that world, but it felt so far away. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Aaliyah. Aaliyah, "Hey sis, Malik's school trip is next week and they need $50 for the bus. Do you think we can send it? He really wants to go." Aisha's heart sank. She knew how much Malik had been looking forward to the trip. It was a rare opportunity for him to get out of the city and experience something new. But $50 was a lot of money, especially when they were already struggling to make ends meet. She hesitated for a moment, then typed a reply. "Aisha, I'll figure something out. Don't worry." As she pressed send, Aisha felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't know how she was going to come up with the extra money, but she couldn't let Malik down. She had promised herself that no matter how hard things got, she would make sure her siblings didn't have to feel the weight of their circumstances. They deserved better than the life they were living. The next few days passed in a blur. Aisha worked double shifts at the grocery store, trying to save every penny she could. She ate only when necessary, often skipping meals so that her siblings could have enough. At night, she found a small corner in a 24-hour diner where she could sit for a few hours, pretending to read a book so that no one would question why she was there so late. She didn't sleep much, but it didn't matter. Her family was her priority. One evening, as Aisha walked out of the store after another long shift, she bumped into an old friend from high school. His name was Marcus, and they had been close once back when things were simpler, before her family's world had started to crumble. "Aisha, wow, it's been a while," Marcus said, flashing her a warm smile. Aisha forced a smile in return, though she felt self-conscious. Marcus looked good, clean-cut, well-dressed, successful. He had always been ambitious, and it seemed like life had rewarded him for it. "Yeah, it has," Aisha replied, shifting uncomfortably. They chatted for a few minutes, catching up on old times. Marcus told her about his new job at a marketing firm, how he had just moved into a new apartment in a nicer part of town. He seemed genuinely happy, and Aisha was glad for him. But as they talked, she couldn't help but feel the growing divide between them. His life was moving forward, while hers felt like it was stuck in place, weighed down by responsibilities she hadn't chosen. "What about you, Aisha?" Marcus asked, his tone light but curious. "What have you been up to?" Aisha hesitated. How could she explain the struggle she faced every day without sounding pitiful? She didn't want his sympathy. She didn't want anyone's pity. So she smiled and gave the same answer she had been giving for months. "Oh, just working and trying to figure things out." Marcus nodded, not pressing further, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Concern, maybe? It didn't matter. Aisha couldn't afford to let anyone see the truth, not even an old friend. As they parted ways, Marcus gave her a friendly hug and told her to keep in touch. Aisha nodded, promising herself that she wouldn't. She couldn't afford to get close to anyone, not while her life was hanging by a thread. That night, Aisha sat in the diner, staring at her phone, trying to figure out how she was going to pay for Malik's school trip. The $50 seemed like an impossible amount, given how little she had left after sending money to her family. She considered asking for an advance at work, but she didn't want to risk raising any red flags. She couldn't let Mrs. Benson know how dire things were. As she sipped her water, Aisha noticed a woman sitting a few tables away, dressed in expensive clothes and talking loudly on her phone. The woman was complaining about a dress she had ordered online that didn't fit properly. Aisha listened, half amused, half disgusted. The woman was furious over a dress that probably cost more than Aisha made in a month. The stark contrast between their lives hit Aisha hard. She was sitting there, hungry, worried about $50, while this woman was angry about something so trivial. It would never be fair. But Aisha knew better than to dwell on it. She had learned long ago that life didn't care about fairness. The next day, as Aisha was walking to work, she saw a flyer taped to a lamppost. It was for a local community centre offering small grants to families in need. The words, financial assistance, caught her eye, and she quickly tore the flyer down, stuffing it into her bag. After her shift, Aisha made her way to the community centre, a small, run-down building nestled between two apartment blocks. Inside, the air smelled of old carpet and stale coffee. A young woman behind the desk greeted her with a tired smile. "How can I help you today?" the woman asked. Aisha hesitated for a moment, feeling a wave of shame wash over her. She had never asked for help like this before, but she knew she had no choice. "I saw the flyer about the financial assistance," Aisha said quietly. "I was hoping to apply." The woman nodded and handed her a form. "Just fill this out, and we'll see what we can do. It's not much, but every little bit helps." Aisha filled out the form with shaky hands, detailing her family's financial struggles. As she handed it back, she felt exposed, vulnerable, like she had just shared a part of herself that she had worked so hard to hide. "We'll be in touch soon," the woman said kindly. A week passed, and Aisha hadn't heard back from the community centre. Malik's school trip was fast approaching, and the knot in her stomach grew tighter with each passing day. She had managed to scrape together $20 by cutting back on meals and working an extra shift, but it wasn't enough. One evening, as Aisha was sitting in the park after work, her phone rang. It was Aaliyah. "Hey, Aisha." Aaliyah's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I talked to Mom today. She's not doing well. The hospital bills are piling up again, and I don't know how we're going to pay them." Aisha closed her eyes, the weight of her family's struggles pressing down on her like a crushing force. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up, how much more she could give before she had nothing left. "I'll figure it out," Aisha said, though she had no idea how. After hanging up, Aisha sat in the fading light, staring at the empty playground in front of her. She felt hollow, like a shell of herself. The struggle had consumed her, left her with nothing but exhaustion and fear. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being the one her family could rely on. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was breaking. Just as she was about to leave, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from the community centre. "Community centre. Congratulations! Your application for financial assistance has been approved. Please stop by the centre to collect your grant." Aisha's heart raced as she read the message. Relief washed over her like a wave. She had been given a lifeline, a small ray of hope in the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send Malik on his school trip and help with the bills, at least for a little while. A few days later, Aisha stood outside the community centre, holding the small check in her hands. She had done it. She had found a way to help her family, to keep them going just a little longer. As she walked home, she felt lighter, like a burden had been lifted, even if just for a moment. But deep down, Aisha knew the struggle wasn't over. It never would be. The line between survival and despair was thin, and she had been walking it for too long. But as long as her family needed her, she would keep fighting. She would keep going, no matter how hard it got. Because that was what love looked like. Unseen, quiet, but always there, pushing her forward.